I knew something was wrong the moment I saw sunlight where sunlight wasn't supposed to be. Not because a tree had fallen, not because a gate had been left open, but because 200 feet of my family's fence had simply vanished. 3 days later, the people responsible sent me a bill for $20,000 and expected me to thank them for it. 10 days after that, I was standing beside an open trench watching the future of their luxury estate disappear one legal document at a time. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 61 years old, retired from the electrical utility industry after nearly 4 decades. Most people hear that and think power lines, transformers, maintenance crews. That's part of it. What they don't understand is that after 38 years working on infrastructure, you stop seeing the world the way other people do. You start noticing the invisible things. Easements, rights of way, access agreements, buried lines nobody thinks about until the day they stop working. And trust me, people only notice infrastructure when it's gone. I live outside Red Basin, Wyoming, on a piece of land that's been in my family since my grandfather came home from World War II. Back then it wasn't much. Just dry grass, wind, and stubborn determination. My grandfather built the ranch one fence post at a time. My father expanded it. I inherited it. 150 acres of open country. Nothing fancy. No marble countertops. No imported landscaping. No infinity pools. Just land. The kind of land that remembers who walked on it. Most mornings start the same way. Coffee before sunrise. Feed the horses. Walk the property line. Check the fences. Listen to the wind. It sounds boring to some people. To me, it feels like peace. At least it did until the Harlans moved in. The old Jensen property bordered my western boundary. For decades, it sat mostly empty except for cattle and the occasional hunting cabin. Then one spring, everything changed. Construction crews arrived. Then surveyors. Then architects. Then more construction crews. For nearly 18 months, it looked like somebody was trying to build a resort in the middle of ranch country. The new owner was Grant Harland. Tech money. California money. The kind of money that arrives fast and assumes it invented success. His wife, Vanessa, ran some luxury design company. I only knew that because her face kept appearing in magazines at the dentist's office. By the time construction finished, their house looked less like a home and more like something from a science fiction movie. Glass walls, steel beams, imported stone. At night, it glowed across the valley like a spaceship that had accidentally landed in Wyoming. They never introduced themselves, never came by, never waved, not once. Now, I don't expect friendship from every neighbor. Some folks keep to themselves. That's fine, but there's a difference between privacy and arrogance. You can feel it. The Harlans had that feeling. The first year passed quietly enough. Then little things started happening. Construction vehicles cutting too close to my fence line. Landscapers wandering onto my property. Security cameras pointed in directions that seemed questionable. Nothing major, just enough to leave a bad taste in your mouth. I let most of it go. Life's too short to fight every battle. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. I was making my usual rounds when I noticed something fell off. You know that strange sensation when your brain spots a problem before your eyes fully understand it? That's what happened. I stopped walking, looked ahead, and just stared, because the cedar fence my grandfather had built decades ago was gone. Not damaged, not leaning, not knocked over by weather. Gone. In its place stood a massive wall of polished glass panels stretching across the property line like some billionaire's monument to himself. For a moment, I honestly thought I was losing my mind. I walked closer, touched the glass. Real, cold, expensive, and absolutely not supposed to be there. That's when I saw the envelope hanging from my gate. Heavy paper, fancy printing, the kind of envelope that practically announces it costs too much. I opened it right there, started reading, then read it again, then a third time, because surely I had misunderstood something. But I hadn't. It was an invoice. Boundary Modernization Project. Shared Improvement Assessment. $20,000 due within 30 days. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes something is so ridiculous your brain rejects reality for a second. They tore down my family's fence. Built their own wall. Then sent me the bill. I stood there looking at that invoice while the Wyoming wind rattled the paper in my hand. And for the first time since the Harlans arrived, I stopped seeing them as annoying neighbors. I started seeing them as a problem. What I didn't know yet was that buried underneath both our properties was a mistake so expensive it would eventually make that $20,000 invoice look like pocket change. And the first person who helped me see it wasn't a judge, a surveyor, or even a neighbor. It was my attorney. I drove into town that same afternoon and parked outside the office of my attorney, Claire Morgan. Claire had spent over 20 years handling property disputes across 3 counties. And if there was one thing people learned about her, it was that she rarely sounded surprised. So when I laid the invoice on her desk and explained what happened, I expected outrage. Instead, she just sat there quietly reading. Then she leaned back in her chair. Huh, that was it. Just one word. Huh, I asked. She tapped the invoice against the desk. Ethan, before we talk about the fence, I want you to look into something else. What? Utility easements. I frowned. What do utilities have to do with any of this? Claire folded her hands. Maybe nothing. Then she smiled slightly. Or maybe everything. I knew that look. Lawyers get a certain expression when they've spotted something you haven't. I left her office and drove straight to the county records building. The place hadn't changed in decades. Same faded walls. Same fluorescent lights. Same smell of old paper and dust. The county clerk on duty was Linda Foster, a woman who probably knew more about local land ownership than most of the people who actually own the land. When I told her I needed every recorded document related to my property and the Harlan parcel, she raised an eyebrow. This about the fancy glass palace. Word travels fast in small towns. I nodded. She disappeared into the archives and came back with enough paperwork to fill a suitcase. I spent nearly 3 hours going through everything. Deeds, surveys, amendments, boundary maps, utility records. At first I found nothing unusual. Then I started following the infrastructure routes, and suddenly things became very interesting. The electrical feed supplying the Harlan estate crossed my property. Not surprising. The water line crossed my property too. Also not surprising. Then I found the fiber optic cable route. Same thing. Everything crossed my land. The problem wasn't where the lines were. The problem was what wasn't there. The easements. There should have been legal agreements, recorded permissions, signed documents, county filings, something, anything. Instead, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I checked twice, then 3 times. Then I asked Linda to verify it. She spent 15 minutes looking through additional records before returning. No easements. TheirEntireMansionRanThrough. None. She shook her head. Not a single one. For a moment, I just sat there, because I knew exactly what that meant. Most people wouldn't, but I spent almost 4 decades working around infrastructure. I understood how vulnerable expensive systems become when the legal paperwork underneath them doesn't exist. The Harlans weren't connected through properly documented access. Legally speaking, every utility serving that estate was crossing private property without protection. Mine. I left the county building with copies of everything and drove home in complete silence. By the time I reached my ranch, the anger I'd been carrying all morning had changed into something else. Focus. That evening I called Claire. They don't have easements. I know. I nearly dropped the phone. You knew. I suspected. Why didn't you tell me? Because sometimes people need to discover leverage themselves. I laughed. Lawyers are weird. We get paid to be. Then her tone became serious. Ethan, if those records are accurate, the Harlans have a very large problem. How large? She paused. Potentially 7 figures. I looked out the kitchen window toward the distant glow of their house. The same house that seemed untouchable a week earlier. Now it looked different. Not weaker. Just exposed. Claire outlined the next steps. First, hire a licensed surveyor. Second, confirm the exact property boundary. Third, document any encroachments. Fourth, issue formal notice. Everything had to be done correctly. No shortcuts. No emotional decisions. No cowboy behavior. If this escalated, every move needed to survive court scrutiny. The survey happened 2 days later. The surveyor was a man named Hank Russell, 70 years old, sunburned face, the kind of guy who trusted measurements more than opinions. We spent most of the morning walking the boundary line, checking markers, reviewing coordinates, comparing modern GPS readings with historical plats. Around lunchtime, Hank lowered his equipment and sighed. Well, that's not ideal. I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next. What is it? He pointed toward the glass wall. They crossed onto your property. How far? 4.5 inches. I looked at the glass panels. 4.5 inches. That didn't sound like much. But in property law, inches can cost fortunes. Hank nodded toward the structure. They built the entire thing on the wrong side. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Certainty. The next morning, Claire sent formal notices. Certified mail. Signature required. The letters outlined everything. Boundary encroachment. Unauthorized fence removal. Lack of recorded easements. 72 hours to negotiate a solution before further legal action would begin. Then we waited. The first response came faster than expected. 36 hours later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. A smooth voice greeted me. Mr. Walker, this is Grant Harland. Of course it was. I leaned back in my chair. What can I do for you? There was a brief pause. I received your attorney's letter. I am aware. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I almost smiled. Funny how people always discover misunderstandings when lawyers get involved. What part confused you? I asked. His voice tightened slightly. The part where you're threatening legal action over a simple improvement. Improvement. That word again. I looked out toward the pasture. My grandfather built that fence. Another pause. We upgraded it. No, I said quietly. You removed it. Silence. Then he tried a different angle. If compensation is your concern, we're prepared to discuss a reasonable payment. That's when I realized he still didn't understand. This wasn't about money anymore. It's not about compensation. Then what is it about? It's about ownership. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. When he spoke again, the confidence was mostly gone. What exactly are you threatening? I stood and walked to the window. Their house shimmered in the distance. Beautiful. Expensive. Completely dependent on infrastructure crossing my land. I'm not threatening anything. I said, I'm pointing out reality. Then I added the sentence that changed everything. Your estate doesn't have legal protection for a single utility crossing my property. Nothing. Not even breathing. Just silence. Finally he spoke. Very quietly. What are you saying? I smiled. For the first time since this whole mess began, I knew something he didn't. I'm saying you should call your attorney. And I hung up. The next morning the excavation crew arrived. Not to cut anything. Not yet. Just to expose the lines. Because once buried facts become visible, people stop arguing about whether they exist. And by noon that day, the first trench was open, the first conduit was visible, and somewhere inside that glass mansion, a very wealthy man was beginning to understand how expensive arrogance can become. By noon, the trench stretched across a good portion of my property, and for the first time, the infrastructure that kept the Harland estate alive was sitting out in the open for everyone to see. Électrical conduit, water lines, fiber cable, everything laid bare beneath the Wyoming sun like evidence in a courtroom. The phone call started almost immediately. First came an attorney from a large firm in Denver. Then another. Then another. Each conversation sounded a little different, but the message was basically the same. Slow down. Wait. Let's discuss this. Let's be reasonable. Funny thing about that word. Reasonable. Nobody had been talking about reasonable when my fence disappeared. Nobody had been talking about reasonable when a $20,000 invoice showed up on my gate. Now, suddenly everybody wanted reason. Late that afternoon, Claire called. They filed for emergency relief. I nodded. Figure they would. The judge denied it. Just like that. Denied. No dramatic courtroom battle. No television moment. Just a judge looking at property records and concluding the law was the law. The following day was strangely quiet. No calls. No letters. No threats. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you somebody is scrambling behind closed doors. Then, around 1 o'clock, a black SUV rolled slowly up my driveway. I already knew who it was before the engine stopped. Grant Harland stepped out alone. No attorney. No assistant. No security detail. Just Grant. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked like an ordinary man instead of a man accustomed to getting his way. His shoulders seemed heavier. His confidence looked worn around the edges. He walked toward the porch while I sat in my usual chair, holding a cup of coffee. When he finally stopped a few feet away, neither of us spoke immediately. The wind moved through the grass between us. A horse snorted somewhere behind the barn. Then he broke the silence. You've made your point. I took a sip of coffee. Have I? He glanced toward the distant trench, the exposed utility corridor, the survey flags, the excavation equipment, evidence everywhere. His jaw tightened. This doesn't need to continue. I studied him for a moment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just curiosity, because I genuinely wanted to know whether he understood what happened. You know what the real problem is? I asked. He didn't answer. You thought this was about money. His eyes dropped briefly. I continued. You looked at an old rancher and assumed everything had a price tag. A long silence followed. Finally, he nodded. Maybe not agreeing, but understanding. I stood and walked inside. A few seconds later, I returned carrying a folder. Claire and I had prepared it the night before. I handed it to him. He opened it, started reading, turned one page, then another, then another. The color slowly drained from his face. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Smaller. $948,000. $948,612. His eyes lifted toward me. You're serious. Very. The proposal included everything. Long-term utility easements, infrastructure access rights, maintenance agreements, legal expenses, fence restoration, property damages, future inspection authority. Every number supported by documentation. Every clause drafted by professionals. He stared at the final page. This feels like extortion. I shook my head. No. Then I pointed toward the horizon. That's the cost of permission you forgot to ask for. The wind carried away the silence that followed. Finally, he closed the folder. What happens if I refuse? A fair question. I respected him a little for asking it directly, so I gave him a direct answer. You reroute everything. His expression hardened. You know that's not realistic. Neither was sending me a bill for my own fence. For the first time, I saw something that looked almost like embarrassment. Not anger, not arrogance. Embarrassment, because deep down he knew exactly where this started. A few minutes later, he climbed back into the SUV and left. No threats, no promises, no dramatic final words. Just a man driving away with a decision to make. The next week felt surprisingly normal. I fed horses, checked water tanks, fixed a loose gate hinge, changed the oil in my truck. Life kept moving. Then on the 10th morning, my phone rang. It was Claire. I answered. Morning. It's done. I leaned back in my chair. How done? The agreement was signed. I smiled. And the funds cleared this morning. For a second, I just sat there quietly, listening to the clock on the kitchen wall, listening to the faint wind outside. Almost $1 million. Not because I chased it, not because I planned it, because somebody crossed a line and refused to acknowledge it until reality forced them to. What about the fence? I asked. Claire laughed. They already hired a restoration crew. I thanked her and hung up. Then I poured another cup of coffee and sat there looking out the window. The ranch looked exactly the same. Same fields, same barn, same horizon. Yet somehow everything felt different. Over the following weeks, the glass wall disappeared piece by piece. Crew after crew arrived. Panels came down. Trucks hauled them away. Eventually, the entire structure vanished. In its place, new cedar posts rose from the ground. Fresh wood, fresh wire. Simple, strong, the way a boundary should look. One afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived at my front door. No invoice this time. No legal language. No demands. Just an apology. Short, professional, sincere enough. I read it once and set it aside. A few days later, I found the original invoice buried inside a drawer. The $20,000 bill that started everything. I stared at it for a while. Then I bought a frame. Not because I wanted a trophy. Honestly, the money mattered less than people assume. What mattered was the lesson. So I framed that invoice and hung it above my coffee station where I still see it every morning. Not as a reminder of victory, as a reminder of boundaries. Because that's what this whole story was really about. Not fences, not utility lines, not lawsuits. Boundaries. The visible ones. The invisible ones. The lines people think they can cross when they have enough money, influence, or confidence. The funny thing is, those lines usually stay invisible right up until someone pushes back. Then suddenly everyone remembers they were there all along. Now I'll be honest. Maybe I could have handled things differently. Maybe I could have knocked on Grant's door the first day and tried to talk it through. Maybe we could have avoided lawyers, avoided trenches, avoided nearly $1 million changing hands. Maybe, but then again, he could have knocked on mine before tearing down a fence my family built generations ago. So I'll leave that question to you. Who was really in the wrong here? Did I go too far? Did Grant get exactly what he deserved? Or were both of us too stubborn to back down once pride got involved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to hear where you stand. If you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors, property disputes, or somebody who thought money put them above the rules, share your story too. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around because sometimes the most unbelievable stories aren't the ones people make up. They're the ones that actually happen.